not about money. It's about sending a message.
Batman is not a simple heroic figure, and that's the reason I was interested in him of all superheroes, because he has no superpowers. He is the most human of superheroes, therefore, and I think he's very, very flawed, and I think that the more that those flaws are allowed to just bubble under the surface, you know, underneath the sort of triumphalism, I think that makes things, I think it makes it more like real life, frankly. One of the story elements I'm continually drawn to is that the protagonist who suffers, I think if that comes from inside themselves somehow, if they are somehow responsible for their own predicament, I find that very evocative. I find that very, very much more moving than if it's as simple as, oh, well, here's a bad guy and he's doing bad things. Not to get too pretentious, but from Shakespeare and all the rest, you know, it's something that has struck a chord with me. It's this idea that if the seeds of your own destruction really are internal, they really are coming from inside yourself, it heightens everything and heightens the sense of tragedy to do with everything. In the case of Batman and this story, it's a question of finding the positivity in it. It's a question of saying, here is a character, like the protagonist of my other films, I think, who is driven by extraordinarily negative things. But what makes him a heroic figure, and it's something we had to constantly bear in mind, is the fact that he's able to channel these negative impulses into something positive, into something altruistic, something relating to helping other people, rather than just the notion of personal vengeance. The interesting thing about Batman as a figure is that he's driven by very, very dark things. There's a lot of rage, a lot of anger that really, really motivates him, but he's trying to channel it into something good. But he's really playing with fire, you know, he's working outside the law, he's doing all kinds of very questionable things, but in the service of good. That really is playing with fire, that really is riding this knife edge. So what we do in the Dark Knight is we just sort of test that, using the character of the Joker, who's this extraordinary force of anarchy. Somebody who just lives and delights in taking people's rule sets and turning them, you know, against themselves. It's sort of the ideal way to get to the core of Batman and the paradox of Batman, because he's somebody who's essentially doing bad things for good reason. He's using, you know, force and vigilantism and intimidation, but he's trying to do it in the service of good, and I think it's an interesting place to have you. I think the Joker understands Batman, or feels he understands Batman, possibly in a way that Bruce Wayne doesn't entirely understand himself. And I think in the interrogation scene, it's interesting to see how the Joker is able to get under his skin. We like to think of our heroes, our heroic figures, as being immune to those kind of mind games. But of course, we all know that Batman is the most tortured and psychologically unbalanced in a way of these heroes. And so he's very vulnerable to the threat that the Joker poses, and we try and continually remind the audience of that during the course of the film.
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
You reach a point where you really don't know what's possible, what's not possible, what's allowed in this story and what's not allowed in this story. And I think that makes the Joker become a very, very unpredictable character. I think at times you really do feel he's prepared to do absolutely anything. So that the physicality of the story is all geared towards getting to a point near the end of the movie where you're actually concerned the whole city will go down. You're actually concerned that this guy is going to completely destabilize that society. I think you feel that the Joker has a drive to tear the world down. The line we gave Alfred to sort of sum it up really is, you know, this idea that some men just want to watch the world burn. That to us was the most frightening way of approaching the character, that he isn't someone who can be in any way negotiated with in a material sense or a legal sense or a political sense. He is just somebody who wants to tear everything down around him. And really it's sort of, you know, comes back to very elemental things like society's sort of fear of youth and teenagers and rebellion and punk and all of these things. And these are all things we talked about a lot in putting the character together at the very beginning. My brother Jonah, who co-wrote the screenplay with me, and David Goyer and myself came up with the story. But for us, you know, one of, I think, society's most palpable fears is the fear of the collapse to anarchy, the idea of people in society who will not in any way be bound by any kind of convention, whether that of society or even the convention of criminal society within the larger society. Very much what drives both the film and the novel is the terrifying idea of the absolutely lawless and yet somehow attractive anarchy that teenage rebellion can present, taken to its absolutely most appalling extreme. we really wanted to get a little bit of that into this idea of who the Joker is. We wanted a very youthful sense to the Joker, a very, as I say, sort of punk sensibility to the Joker. The force of the Joker, the character, I like to say, sort of cuts through the story like the shark in Jaws. He's a force to be reacted to. Well, because he's not acting from a sense of logic, he is effectively a monster in the film. He's a very human monster. As the Joker does things in the story, it tests the characters. It forces them to confront things about themselves. I very much like that in terms of its approach to villainy, because I think that it puts it onto the characters that we already know, particularly the characters, you know, from the first film and from the comics and everything. So you're seeing characters that you've come to know forced into very uncomfortable decisions and very paradoxical situations, and it tells you something about those characters. It reveals them in sort of new and interesting ways.
Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Well, I think for me it comes from my interest in film noir and what sort of defines that. Not for me being so much the visual style, but the form of characterization that you get in those great stories. The idea that character is defined through action. Very often these films are centred around a protagonist who's either an unreliable narrator, which is what we played with very much in Memento, or simply someone who has some flaw in them, some tragic flaw that you know early on there's an indicator in the story that this is going to snowball into something catastrophic. And in The Dark Knight, I found a lot of interest in the character of Harvey Dent for myself. He's a very heroic figure at the beginning. He's the guy that Bruce Wayne sees as being able to take over for him. He's a hero without a mask. He's a positive figure for Gotham to rally behind, who can take over for Batman. But in the way that Aaron Eckhart plays him, there's something right from the beginning you see in him that's questionable. You see a sort of vaulting ambition. You see a germ of darkness there that can, and of course therefore will, in this kind of story, rise up and turn into something ugly. I had an idea of what the Joker would be in the world we'd created of Batman Begins. And to me, it was creating a sort of psychologically credible anarchist, a force of anarchy, a force of chaos, a purposeless criminal, a psychopath. To me, that is the most frightening form of evil. The enemy who has no rules, the enemy who's not out for anything, who can't be understood, can only be fought. With all of the major story movements of The Dark Knight, we've tried to imbue them with a sense of inevitability. You really want, kind of in the first reel, to set up a set of expectations and feelings about the type of story that you're going to see and the way in which these things are going to play out for these characters. But hopefully we'll try and, you know, surprise people in terms of how those things come to pass.
See, madness, as you know, is like gravity. All it takes is a little push.
Well, particularly in The Dark Knight, we felt that, you know, if Batman now, you know, rules the night in Gotham, daytime is going to be the more threatening aspect, because the Joker rules the day, essentially. You know, in our telling of this story, we've never felt that Bruce Wayne could ever go out as Batman in daylight. That, you know, the costume would appear ridiculous to the other characters. It wouldn't be threatening without the cover of darkness. So we've always sort of treated him a bit like Dracula or something. You know, that the actual Batman himself can only come out after dark. For that reason, a lot of our most threatening scenes in The Dark Knight we chose to have in broad daylight, as you say. When you turn the lights on, and in the interrogation scene, for example, we tried to really invert expectations and begin very, very dark and have people think that's how the scene will play out. But then we actually went incredibly bright with the whole scene, because when you're in broad daylight, when the sun is out, when the lights are on, I think in cinematic terms you're not pushing the audience one way or the other. You're not cluing them into where the scene is going to go. And there's an interestingly unpredictable sense that helps. And there's also at times a certain bleakness that evokes that I think can get under the skin a little more effectively.
If you're good at something, never do it for free.
I think really the only useful advice I ever got in terms of, you know, trying to figure out your way into the film business, the film industry, is to get yourself a script and hang on to it. It's that idea, that screenplay, that concept, you know, whatever that's going to be, that's so important. And you have to stick to your guns. You have to find something that you can do that maybe other people couldn't do. And even if that seems different or doesn't fit into people's expectations, that's what's going to distinguish it if you can do it successfully.